with a presentation prepared. I come and I like to listen to what's going on at the conference in order to get a sense of what are we talking about, what is of interest to you. And it's been very striking for me at this conference to see that we have a number of different discussions, a number of different conversations. We're trying to address a number of different questions. So we have some discussion about what's happening in the world and how that might affect our agenda. We have some concerns about the practicality of our discussion and how that might be applied. We have some concerns about are we discovering any rigorous science, and then we have some discussion for which Gianni is really the spokesperson about the concept of value creation. So I just want to go through those very quickly, because if we're not aware that there are some different discussions going on, then we don't really understand why we're sometimes talking past each other and why we're getting into some kind of argument. So if we just focus on this for a moment, on the social trends that lead in particular to the discussion about knowledge cities, we find that Nicholas gave us a talk here about sustainability and the notion that we better get more intelligent about the way we organize our lives if we want it to make sustainable. And you remember that very stark figure of that in 2050 we're going to be operating in a way that's consuming 2.5 times the resources that we actually have in the world. So there's this kind of discussion. And then, of course, there's a very important discussion about demographics, about the increase of the world population to 9 billion and what that's going to do to the way in which we organize our lives. And, of course, behind that is the concern with what kind of political and economic system can we imagine coming into existence in order to take care of these new conditions that are arising. And those of us that are paying attention to what's going on in what we like to call the European project, and I guess that's pretty much all of us, know that we're going through some very, very important times, and we have no idea what the other side looks like. And this is about the reconstruction of our social, political, and economic systems. So Nicholas is raising this question. So this is a very interesting discussion. If we go to the best practices thing, Jay's talk, you remember these 10 tips for effective knowledge management. These are practice-based heuristics. What normally goes wrong with knowledge-based projects? Now, this is a completely different discussion, obviously, from the one that Nicholas was getting us into. But it itself is a very important issue of, as we know, most knowledge management projects fail, certainly more than 50%, and we're not at all clear about why these fail, and so forth. So this is a completely separate discussion. I don't think many of the papers have addressed this particular topic, which has been of interest to me for 5 years or so. Why do knowledge management projects fail? Some of the normal nostrums here, well, we need to get some senior management backing and so forth. And one thing that I have found it useful to talk about, especially amongst consultants who are interested in knowledge management, is don't try and re-engineer the whole company. So when I do project by project, it is take one project at a time. Don't think about re-engineering the whole company in terms of knowledge-based approach. And that's a discussion that I'm very happy to engage with other people. There's also this notion of your knowledge management projects will only succeed if you achieve a sense of ownership amongst the people who are going to be affected by it. Because then that sense of ownership creates the possibility of having the project succeed. And there's a lot of discussion there. And at this conference we haven't talked much about it, but that was the essence of Jay's presentation. Now, most of you at the conference, when I say most, I mean in terms of most numbers of you, are concerned with, can we make this into a science? And there are a number of reasons why that is the conversation. And of course the main one is that we have an A-journal definition of what constitutes a knowledge object, which is a published paper. So you know, especially for those of you who are still in the PhD program, you're worrying about how do we create a knowledge object that will be recognized and give you legitimacy and a job, perhaps. Unfortunately, that system, I think, is not very good in terms of encouraging us to produce things that are of actually much value. But it's a very significant discussion, and the bulk of the papers that I've heard in terms of presentation are, can we find some science here, and can we nail that down in a publishable paper in ways that are good for your career and maybe add to the discipline. So there's a publish or perish pressure here, and I'm not certain that that's been very productive in the field of knowledge management. I'm not sure that we have accumulated much real sense of the science of this. And if we look at Tanan Javier's presentation, I found the pair of you searching for some kind of science of urban development, which is grounded in the concept of knowledge. So Javier in particular was talking about trying to arrive at some relatively crisp definitions of knowledge that would enable you to construct a science. And we see that there are several levels at which this science can be constructed. One is the level of the firm. Can we have some theory of competitive advantage which is based on the concept of knowledge as opposed to who knows what, but as a theory of the competitive firm based on the superior knowledge assets or better managed knowledge assets and so forth. There's also a social level discussion here about can we imagine a social system which is based on a better understanding of how to use knowledge, how to distribute knowledge, so all the knowledge collection, distribution, evaluation mechanism is part of seeking a science for doing this. And of course it gets us into the task of trying to define and measure knowledge. Now, I have a lot of problem with this project. I'm saying I understand the project because you want to produce a knowledge object, a publishable paper, or a published paper, because that's part of the career structure of the institutional system in which that we inhabit. But it begins with the attempt to define knowledge. And it's not clear to me that this is a viable thing to do. So over the years, I've attempted to scream and say, you can't do it, and I've attempted to criticize people's attempts to do it. And what I'm really trying to do is to make people sensitive to the special difficulties involved with the concept of knowledge. And my discussion about knowledge absences is my attempt to help us understand the strangeness of the concept of knowledge. If you can't define knowledge, then I think this science project becomes very difficult. If, on the other hand, you can grasp knowledge in a different way, maybe we could have a different kind of science. I'm not clear what that would be like, but I think that the promise of the knowledge management field spins out of understanding the special peculiarity of knowledge. So that's, in that area, I'd be concerned, because ultimately, if we can define knowledge, then we can engage in this discussion about how can we manage these assets better, how we collect them, evaluate them, distribute them, and so forth. But if we can't define knowledge, where do we go? And that's in a way, what my presentation is about. So we get to value creation. This value creation discussion, in my interpretation, is the confrontation of knowledge absence. So the idea of creating value is creating something that did not previously exist. It isn't simply a question of taking a knowledge asset from one place and moving it to another. Okay, that's either theft or market opportunities or market activity. But the concept of value creation is to bring into the world something that was not there beforehand. So this says, if we're interested in knowledge assets, we should be interested in this process of bringing valuable knowledge into the world. And that's really what I want to talk about. And Gianni's talk here is, if you want to talk about bringing something new into the world, you have to sort of have a trick. You have to have some, some way of talking about this that is not the characteristic sort of billiard ball science, where you have an object and you hit it with some variable, and then you look at the consequences, cause and effect thinking. You have to have some different way of thinking about it, and that's the real special problem in this area. If you want to talk about things coming into existence that did not previously exist, how do you talk about that? So Gianni has his way of doing this, and I have my way of doing this, so I'm trying to just use a little cross-illumination between my way of talking about this and Gianni's way. So Gianni, excuse me. So Gianni was talking about, you have to have some things present. So first of all, you have to be in the world. This is not an abstraction. You have to be in the world, and when you're in the world, you experience the world. And the experiencing of the world begins the possibility of bringing something new, in this case a commentary about your experience, that has the possibility of bringing something new into the world. And Gianni is saying that this is not a rational observation of the world. This is about an experience of the world, which is an emotional experience of the world. And this emotional content of that experience enables you to bring something new, which was not present. So the experiencing of the world is not representation. It's not taking a photograph of the world and reporting the world as an objective fact. It's an emotional engagement with the world that allows you to see the world differently. And it's in that difference that you have the concept of bringing something new. And this requires some kind of energetic engagement with the world. So you get the point that if we have these 6 different concepts where emotion is different from experience and energy is different from emotion, and ethics gives you another insight into the way in which we live and experience ourselves in the world, this interplay between these things that are different, Gianni's 6 E's, gives you some kind of space in which you can imagine what it means to bring something new into the world. So now we're looking at the idea of knowledge as a way both of dealing with what has been brought into the world and the process of bringing something into the world. And these 2 aspects inform each other. If you try and do knowledge management as a scientific observation of knowledge assets without considering where they come from, you don't understand the nature of the thing that you are observing. And therefore you don't understand the nature of the consequences of deploying that. So it's the duality here that's important, the interplay. And if you want to talk about value creation, if you want to talk about bringing something new into the world, you have to have some kind of academic trickery. Now, academics are only of interest to other people in the world because they have the capacity for this mental trickery that enables people to view the conditions of being in the world, the conditions of living, in a new way. So our function as academics is to help people who are living in the world understand the world in a way that they did not before we did our work. So if we go back to Isaac Newton, here's Isaac Newton, and he's asleep under the tree, and the apple falls on his head. Okay, this is something that happened, no doubt, to many people when they're farming, collecting apples in the orchard, going to sleep in the afternoon after some beer, and having apples fall on their head. And this is just an unremarkable consequence. And Newton said, no, this is a very remarkable consequence. In the experience of having the apple fall on your head, you begin to understand the way the universe is constructed and why the earth goes around the sun. So this was an incredible, remarkable intellectual achievement that enabled all of us to understand our own experience of the world in a completely novel way. This is the academic task, to help people who are living in the world understand the world in a novel way. And obviously, the question of knowledge is very central to the experience of being in the world. And we don't inform people about that experience until we consider both the deployment of knowledge, the management of knowledge, and also where knowledge comes from. So it's the combination of those two that enables us to give people a better sense of their experience of living. So one of the first things we get to is that this is not an abstraction. Knowledge is not an abstract. It's about experience of the world. It's about being in the world. There is no abstract concept of knowledge. Knowledge is always about the human experience of the world. It's in the world, in a particular time, in a particular place. So it's a contextualized concept. It's not an abstract concept. How do you know it's not an abstract concept? You know it's not an abstract concept because there is nothing to oppose it against. The experience of not knowledge is something that you only understand as an experience. You can't understand it as an abstraction. If you call it ignorance, then you would have to have some knowledge of ignorance in order to know the difference between knowledge and ignorance. So ignorance, in fact, is just another type of knowledge. This is a philosophical point that drives you to understand that knowledge is an empirical concept. It's about the experience of being in the world. And fundamentally, knowledge is about feeling some degree of competence at dealing with the world. So a definition of knowledge at one level as an abstraction is simply consciousness. But in practical, useful terms, it's about a sense of competence about being in the world. That's actually what we mean by knowledge. And therefore, a knowledge absence is a sense of incompetence, where you don't know how to negotiate the world. And all of us have experienced incompetence. Because knowledge absence is, in fact, an experience that's much more familiar to us than the experience of knowledge, the experience of competence. What are we trying to do with our scientific research? We're trying to make ourselves, our colleagues, our clients more competent, more confident at being in the world. That's what our project's about. And we can't understand that project until we've grasped the concept of knowledge absence, the feeling of incompetence, inability to take action. And that's always in the world. So one of the ways in which we might think of value creation, if we start from the notion of cause and effect, is that we intervene in the world in a particular time and place between the independent variables and the dependent variables. Instead of one thing leading to another, independent of the human condition, we explore our ability to get in the middle of that and make things different from the way they would otherwise have been. So this is a measure of the way in which we introduce something new into the world. And this is an action of creativity and imagination. Now, Gianni uses the word creativity more often than I do, and maybe I use the term imagination more often than he does. This is an attempt to grasp this question of how do human beings bring something new into the world that improves their sense of competence about their presence in the world. So the native condition of the human being is incompetence, incomprehension, inability to understand the world, inability to deal with it. The sense of competence is what we're trying to seek, and we have a little part in that as scientists in the area of knowledge. If we're in medical science, what we're looking for is more competence to deal with the uncertainties of the medical experience of the world, being able to cure sickness, being able to predict sickness, being able to raise infant mortality rates, and so forth. And our little part of that is to do with how can we help people understand their experience better so that they achieve more competence, more confidence in the world. So that's the text of what I'm trying to do. So, I mean, the first thing is this brutal fact that if what we mean by theory in the scientific sense is being able to relate cause and effect, there can be no theory of what is new. You cannot predict novelty, because then it wouldn't be novel if you could predict it. So it's all about breaking out of this very familiar methodology that we have of causal analysis, cause and effect. So it's understanding that between cause and effect there is a space into which the human creativity or human imagination can get in the middle and make things different. And what we're eventually trying to do, of course, is to make things different in a way that makes us feel more competent about controlling the situation, or less incompetent, same thing. So in the real world, everything is new. Okay, so here we are, gathered relatively early in the morning, and we're all having to remake this day as we go through it. You have to sit there and you say, am I going to listen to DSC, or am I going to think about something else? Or am I going to nip outside and do my email? And all of the time we're reinventing the possibilities for the next moment. The way we live our lives is not as a matter of prediction. So we're constantly constructing our lives. And there can be no theory of that. This is to do with the human experience and how the human experience is not driven by cause and effect relations. It's about the way we live our lives. So the way in which we can speak about this is tricky. Okay? It's difficult to talk about. It's easier to talk about cause and effect. That Europe is in difficulties because the financial and political system was badly designed. Okay, you can hear about this every day in America. However, what we don't hear about is about why the American system is also failing, which was supposedly well designed or whatever. So we hear this cause and effect discussion all the time, and yet what we're trying to do is get in the middle of it and make things different. So that the way I try and talk about this is always imagine things could have been otherwise. Things could have been worse or better. Things could have been otherwise if our knowledge had been different. So, in the case of the European project, what the American projects are saying is if only the designers of the European project had known better how to design Europe, then there wouldn't have been a crisis. I happen to think that this is not a very useful way of talking. But I hope it makes the point. That we're constantly looking for better knowledge in order to give ourselves a more secure grasp. Now, the way we talk about this process is the difference between the way Gianni talks about the process and the way I talk about the process. Now, we get into our own language about this, and it's sometimes difficult for anybody else to follow what we're doing here. This is the problem. So here I am, it's early in the morning. Some of you are a little bit tired after last night. Maybe I'm a little tired, maybe I can't make it as clear as I would want to make it. But we're doing our best to talk about bringing something new into the world. And from my point of view, this is where the problem that we want innovation theory or entrepreneurship theory or strategy theory to be. For me, it is absolutely incomprehensible that people are trying to create scientific type theories about how to manage innovation. It's sort of like, isn't the researcher trying to be innovative about creating a theory of innovation? And does the theory of innovation that this researcher is trying to create, does it actually apply to the process that he or she is engaged in order to create this theory? Do you follow me? I mean, I find there's little reflexivity in the people that are interested in innovation theory. There's little reflexivity about the process of bringing something new into the world. Okay, so I find this completely incomprehensible. I find the theories of entrepreneurship, the attempt to create a positivistic cause and effect kind of theory of entrepreneurship, I find completely incomprehensible. But the reason that it exists, and the reason that some of you are engaged in this, is because of this quasi-science, this publication, the creation of a knowledge object, the creation of a publishable paper. That's why people are engaged in it, but it's not a consideration of how to help our colleagues become more competent in the world. Enough of that. Now, if we really want to engage this kind of knowledge absence, value creation kind of discussion, there is one person who we have to pay attention to, and that's Edith Penrose. And Edith Penrose has this wonderful sentence on page 25 of her book. It's not so much the resources as the services they provide, for the firm. And the difference between the market value of the resources and the market definition of the resources, the cost definitions of the resources, and the services they provide, that difference is what managers know about how to make better use of the resources than other people. So this is actually a definition of knowledge that is the distance between the definition of the resources and the definition of the services that they provide. So this is saying there is actually no useful definition of tangible resources. This distinction between tangible and intangible is not a useful distinction, because there is nothing that is not intangible. There is no resource whose value is not contingent upon somebody's knowledge. This distinction is not useful. It shields us from the problem of understanding what knowledge is and how value is created. And in the end, there is nothing but the management's view of the situation and the ability to imagine a new view. And it's this imagining a new view that makes the addition of value possible. It is the actual act that leads to the creation of economic value, is the imagining of something different. So this what I call 6E process, borrowing from Gianni's terminology here, this is a way of how do you imagine something new, and this is the source of entrepreneurship and innovation and indeed economic value. Her book is The Theory of the Growth of the Firm. Here are some pictures of Edith, who I was very fortunate to meet before she died. This is the latest edition of her book. This is, if we want to say, what is the Bible? What is the main central book, if we want to look from a knowledge management point of view at business affairs? This is the book. And this is the way I talk about the process. Gianni has 6 Ds. I have some constraints here. Now, the idea of the different colours is that these are different constraints to the way you bring the imagination to bear. Because you can imagine things that you can't make happen. The most obvious, is we could go up to the top of the building, we can imagine flying. Maybe we dreamt about flying last night. We can imagine flying. We go up to the top of the building and jump off, and we discover that even though we can imagine it, we can't bring it about in the world. So as we have an imagination, we attempt to bring it in the world, we confront a certain kind of reality, of the impossibility to bring about everything that we can imagine. But if innovation and value creation is bringing something new into the world, then we must understand this is not simply a free act of creation, but it's about making something present in space, time, here and now. So you can imagine doing a painting, but it's the production of the painting where you run into the reality of the world that you can't paint in 3 dimensions. You paint in 2 dimensions. You can't sculpt in 2 dimensions. You sculpt in 3 dimensions. You can't have a dance that's a permanent art object. It's a transient art object, because that's the nature of the confrontation with reality, as you imagine something and try and bring it into the world. So the different artistic mediums are explorations of different constraints that you meet as you try and bring something new into the world, try and reimagine. So I have this lexicon of constraints that in some ways correspond to Gianni's 6 E's, though there are some differences between us which are not terribly important, but it's the idea of this space, and then you have an active imagination which you're able to bring into the world. This is the process of bringing something new into the world. There's an active imagination that meets and, as it were, conquers constraints. So, in everyday business, we can imagine there are some constraints. Let's say there's a constraint here about funding. The difference in the colours is the different dimensionality, the different substantiality of the constraint. Because the whole thing about business is it's not one-dimensional. There are multiple dimensions there. So here we have a funding constraint. Here we have this dotted line here, the entrepreneur's moral considerations about this. Here we maybe have some government standards. Here we have the competitor's marketing. And we end up with a space, and the challenge is to, as it were, fill that space with not just an active imagination, but brought into the world, actually making it happen. And the point about the dotted lines is that in business, it's not simply about discovering the constraints to the entrepreneurial or innovative possibility. It's understanding that, in fact, we live in a socio-economy. This is not a natural science world. This is a social and socio-economic world that we're living in. And most of these constraints are changeable. They are of our construction. So if we, those of you that have been to therapists, psychological therapists, it's not about just identifying the constraints that you are imposing on yourself, but also coming to realize that you're capable of moving those constraints. So those of you that have engaged, for instance, in Gestalt therapy, understand that it's all about identifying and then being able to move the constraints to your own attitudes and behaviors. So in business, there are two, as it were, 2 dimensions of strategy. One is the discovery of the constraints, and the second is the exploration of the degree to which those constraints can be moved through acts of imagination. So this is a little thing here, I don't know if it works. So just try and get a sense of what you think is new about this. Most of you are familiar with what's going on here, right? There's a guy called Nick Fosbury, and he's beating a world record. So what do you think is new here?
Backflip.
Huh?
The backflip.
Okay, you think the backflip is new. That's not the right answer.
Center of gravity.
Okay, otherwise I wouldn't have put this up, would I? The bar? Well, that's because there was an innovation that enables him to do the backflip, and when you're doing the backflip, the center of gravity passes under the bar. The question is, what's novel? What allowed that? What was the constraint that was moved? The last couple of times, it's the time of the morning. I understand it's the time of the morning is the problem.
The landing pad?
Huh?
The landing pad?
That's it. Who said the landing pad? Yes, sir, you are awake. Okay. If you didn't have the landing pad, you couldn't do the backflip because you would break your back. Now, I have yet to find out how that became possible. To have these landing pads, because when I did high jump, you landed in the sand, right? Those of you, maybe, thank you, Jose Maria, about the same age as myself. Okay, some of you younger guys might have, when you did high jump, you might have had these pads to land on. Okay, so it's not easy to know what is the key innovation that enables you to bring something new into the world. This is quite simple, and the question is, business is always about collaboration, it's about working with other people. It isn't about just having an idea, you have to carry other people along with it. How do you engage in that? And this is another part of the theoretical work that I've been doing over the last few years. Do you just issue instructions? And the answer is, no, you don't understand what an innovation is if you think you can instruct somebody to innovate. That's the whole point, you can't, because you don't have this cause and effect relationship. Okay, so let's go down here. So if we ask Gianni to talk about real-world innovation, he's going to tell a story that using the 6 E's of how people were emotionally engaged and they put a lot of energy and something happened. Okay. Now this story is about the way human beings collaborate together. And this ultimately is a process of language, communication and engagement. Now, the point here is people are not simply being motivated by personal return. People are being motivated by some other concerns. And you have to step outside the microeconomic notion of incentives and behaviors as a result of incentives. That's why it's so important to talk about emotion, because if you get people emotionally involved, you can have them work in ways that are inexplicable, incomprehensible to think about it if you think people only do things because they understand the personal benefit of doing it. So, and we're almost at the end here. I'm saying that it's about the interplay of these two ideas. Here is the cause and effect notion, and here is this novelty notion. And they mutually inform each other. There's no point in this conversation if you forget this. And there's no point in this conversation either unless you understand that there is a world in which there are causes and effects. And it's about the interplay. So what I'm trying to do for the last how many years I'm ashamed to say, is to introduce a sort of sense of dialectic here. So there's two discussions and they mutually inform each other. There's a discussion about knowledge assets, which are objective, measurable, and so forth. And then there's a discussion about knowledge absences, that there's the space for the human imagination in the world to improve people's sense of competence in the world. And the two are an interplaying discussion. So this is the last slide. There is no separate concept of asset value. Every asset's value depends upon somebody's knowledge. The possibility for economic activity is the reimagining of that value possibility. These approaches that we have, these concepts of capital, etc., they're not useful without a consideration of where the capital is generated from. If you think that human capital is the same as the educational expense, you've missed the point. It's because it isn't measurable that it makes it possible to reimagine it. And it makes it possible to think about human capital as a source of innovation. And it's about I think you can make some progress by having this interplay. And for me, there's a very simple kind of heuristic here. imagination, it's a quality of the human mind that we cannot prove. There's no point in trying to identify it in a particular part in the neurological system. That's missing the point. The imagination is something that we experience in our own lives every day. So if you ask me to prove to you that you have imagination, I can't do that. If you can't identify it in yourself, then there's nothing that I can do to persuade you. But if we understand imagination in our own world, then maybe we can bring it to bear on the economic world. But it's not just about ideas. It's about confronting the difficulties of bringing that idea into the world and making something real happen, which is this concept of the constraints and the opportunity spaces. So, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Casey, for this inspiring talk. I have been thinking about a very good definition of knowledge for a very long time, and I couldn't come up with one. But I think I'm going to quote you and use your definition of knowledge is not abstract. It's the sense of competence about being in or appreciating the world. I think this is a very, very good definition. And also, I couldn't, but you again managed to address deep evidencing about knowledge-based development, ignorance-based development. So next time when I see him, by mentioning you, I'll tell him that knowledge is a human experience, ignorance is a type of it as well. So this kind of falsifies his approach of ignorance-based is not against knowledge-based. It's a form of it from based on different worldview. Okay, again, thank you very much. Now I think we have 10 minutes or a bit less for some questions, comments. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, AC. I have one clarification. I have heard a lot of American pragmatism in your speech. How would you respond to that? Dewey's work, who maybe talks about knowledge being experienced and being in the world as knowing the world. How would you relate to that kind of analogy that came up?
Thank you. Paulina can answer the question better than I. Of course, there's a fair amount of pragmatism in it. I think that you give pragmatism too much credit. I mean, this is not a philosophical course, so I don't want to talk specifically about pragmatism as a philosophy. But you remember one of the key quotes from the American pragmatism is don't think about truth value as the representation of reality. Okay, that's not the project that we're engaged in. What we're trying to do is we're trying to improve human society. And James said, don't think about reality and rigorousness as the truth content. Think about cash value. Well, it was his terminology for think about the social improvement that results from the application of what you consider to be the intellectual object. So the pragmatists were very concerned with the application of knowledge in the social context. So to the extent that they're concerned with contextualized evaluation of knowledge, I'm just a pragmatist. There are some aspects of pragmatism that I would not go on with. But there are certainly, and in particular the work of Dewey, you remember Dewey said, if you want to educate people, don't think that you are simply moving a knowledge object from the teacher to the student. This is a hopeless concept of education. What you have to do is to somehow get in touch with the student's knowledge absence. He didn't use that terminology, but with the student's own experience of life and the student's own spirit of inquiry and attempt to improve the competence that they feel about themselves. Now, all of us who've been teachers know that the point at which you can get the student saying, I can see something useful in my life with what you're trying to tell me, then you're beginning a different kind of educational experience, and that's what Dewey education was involved with.
Okay, my question is, thank you. I'm Gerd Ammann from Reutlingen in Germany. My question is, you were talking on the reflexivity of innovation theory, and first, and second, that by imagination you can bring something new to the world you were in. So my point is it really possible to really bring something really new to the world, or is it somehow, even by imagination, by creativity, already arts in some form already in there, but known, not structured, not make known to the world? So is it really new, or is it some kind of discovery was in some form or parts is already there already?
Yeah. Right. This is a very deep, penetrating question. Another way of thinking about what academics do is they're not trying to come up with answers, they're trying to come up with better questions. For me, that's really what academics do. The idea that we can produce something of value is to pretend we are natural scientists. We're not natural scientists, we're social scientists. The work of social science is coming up with better questions. So now, here's the question. If you think that you bring something truly novel into the world, what are the educational implications of that? Maybe spirit of freedom, free inquiry, free debate, etc. In art education, this led to a terrible phase of art education in which you simply let students loose in the art studio. All they did was make a terrible mess. It was replaced by a different concept of art education, which was called discipline-based art education. And that had some very strict, I can't think of the right term, forms of procedure. Okay. One is that you studied art history, so that you needed to understand your place in the sequence of art. You needed to study art appreciation. What could you say about an artistic object? Which was the beginning of art criticism. Because if you can't say anything, then you can't criticize. If you can't criticize, then you cannot criticize your own work, etc. So this was a transformation from a kind of free, open space approach to education to much more, in terms of the Beaux-Arts tradition, of a very structured form of education, where the emphasis is moving from the opportunity space to what I would call the constraints. Studying the constraints, in my view, gives you a much better sense of the opportunity space than pretending you remove all the constraints. So now we come to this question of, can you bring anything new into the world? First of all, if you are thinking of the world in cause and effect basis, this is not a question you can ask. So I feel, okay, bang, one success. Okay, I've enabled you to ask this question. Now, in poetry, when you're constructing poetry, you don't make up new words. The poem is not about making new words. The poem is about taking words that are familiar and using them in novel ways. So now the novelty is beginning to be a sort of second-order novelty. Now, there are many arguments for saying that nothing is actually new. There is nothing new under the sun, we say. We reimagine. So, for instance, when Nicholas was talking about, or maybe it was you, talking about floating cities. Were you talking about floating city? Okay, was it Nicholas talking about floating city? Anyway, those of you from Mexico, of course, know the concept of a floating city is hundreds of years old. And in the Aztec period, and I've forgotten what the name of the lake is, where this...
Xochimilco.
Well, you see, I can't pronounce it either. But the whole concept of a floating city, the whole concept of a floating city was already very much articulated, very complicated. So, I think this is a question to which there is no answer. It turns out to be a nonsense question. All we can ever know about is using what we know in order to find a space that we can reimagine. But the fact that we can have this discussion means that we have already introduced the concept of novelty and the concept of opportunity space, or open space.
If you don't mind, the time is up, but I'll have two questions. One gentleman over there, one lady from here. I'm apologizing just to leave the rest for the personal discussion during lunch or dinner, because we really don't want to further debate the beginning of the next session. And if you could respond concisely, that would be good.
Okay, I'll try to fast it. The 2 points concerning emotions, I'd like to come to the brains of research by Damasio, because there it is essential that constraint brains are all have according to social knowledge. That is, you're constraining acceptability of a solution or whatever.
I'm sorry, I've not understood. I've not heard.
You didn't hear it. Is it the microphone?
Yeah, I think it's a microphone. We need cycle.
Okay. The point is that in Damasio's brain research,
Damasio, yes.
Damasio, he studies especially emotions, and the point there is that the constraints concern social knowledge, that is the acceptability of a result and go on. And coming back to what you said in the beginning, if you start to create new knowledge, then you need simplifications, and these simplifications need to be communicated, and that's and they are in some sense constructive. And so the problem is, if you want to convey the knowledge in some sense, in which way you can convey the kind of simplifications which you use.
Well,
also we need to simplify the question.
Yeah, but I'm not going to answer the question. I mean, I don't want to hide the fact that I'm not going to answer the question. I have no patience whatsoever for Tony Damasio's work.
I see.
So the way of correctly answering the question is for us to sit down over a glass of wine and find out how we can deal with it. So I'm sorry, I'm not really going to answer the question right now, but maybe we could meet later and talk about it.
This is just a short remark. Paulina Bednash from Kazinski University. On the rhetorical level, you talk about the interplay between knowledge absence discourse and knowledge asset discourse. But you seem to exclude from the proper narrative everything positive that is said about let's exclude the word knowledge, but unleashing human creativity. And I was thinking that, well, of course, novelty comes from a situation that is always new, because the context changes constantly. But when we are talking about human beings bringing something new into the world, human agency, then we have something relatively constant, which is the condition of humans are similar to each other. Of course, each and every is unique, but the way we operate is similar. And we can learn it inductively, not deductively, but inductively from the past. How it happened many times that something new was brought into the world. So isn't that the open space for the positive project of knowledge assets? Or let's forget about knowledge, so unleashing imagination, asset, whatever.
Again, this is a very interesting question, and I will dodge answering it directly. Maybe I'm going to go down as the person that never answers any of these questions. What Pauline is pointing to is involved in this discussion is a view of the individual human being. So if the individual human being is a relatively constant thing, then you have the possibility of some kind of cause and effect. Javier did this because Javier is the kind of person who does this. Okay? So we have a lot of research that attempt to identify the constants of the human condition. I'm very interested in destabilizing that view and saying that in fact we are not as constant as we think we are. We are in fact plastic, malleable objects. So when I was talking about the constraint, it's not only the question of the identification of the constraint, but also how to manipulate that constraint in a way that is innovative and productive. In back of this whole approach to organizations is my belief that organizations only exist because people are not able to act in their own interest, but because people are susceptible to being engaged through the 6D process in being somebody new. So that fundamentally economic novelty and economic growth arises out of the possibility of human beings to reimagine themselves into being different people. So just a little embellishment on that. Some of you might know the name of Georges Balanchine, who was the dominant choreographer in the 20th century. And when he came out of the Kirov ballet, and he was operating in Europe, and somebody came over from the States, a guy called Lincoln Kirstein, and saw him and said, I want to bring you to the United States to create the United States' first major ballet school, ballet company. And Georges Balanchine said, first a school, because he knew that if he came to the United States, there was nobody capable of dancing the dances that he wanted to create. So he had, first of all, to create an entirely new type of dancer. So this is the changeability and malleability of the human being is, in my view, the core of the whole economic project.
Please join me in thanking Jason for this. I think we have a couple of announcements.